When you hear the term emerging markets, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's this weird mix of, huge opportunity on one hand and even bigger risk on the other. But what if that whole perception of risk is actually holding us back from one of the most incredible growth stories of our time?
So that's the big question, right? Is the risk overblown, or is the opportunity just hiding in plain sight? In this explainer, we're going to dive deep into the actual data, we'll uncover some of the hidden infrastructure that makes these economies really work, and reveal why the real story here is so much more interesting than the scary headlines might suggest.
All right, let's get into it. Before we can start poking holes in the common narrative, we've got to first understand what that narrative even is. At its core, the definition is pretty simple. We're talking about economies that are in the middle of a massive transformation. Nations that are industrializing at a crazy pace and just unlocking brand new levels of growth. You can really think of them as the next major engine of the global economy.
But along with all that potential comes a reputation for instability. For so many investors, the words emerging markets are basically code for wild, unpredictable swings, political drama, and the potential for some pretty big losses. It's this story of high risk for a shot at high reward.
Okay, so now for the fun part. Let's put that perception to the test. We're going to peel back the headlines and just look at what the hard numbers have been telling us for years.
This quote from the Private Infrastructure Development Group, or PIDG, man, it just hits the nail on the head. It points out that so often, it's the feeling of risk, not the actual reality of it, that decides where the money goes. Or maybe more importantly, where it doesn't.
Which, of course, leads to the million-dollar question. Are these fears actually based on real evidence? Or is this just a classic case of perception creating its own kind of distorted reality?
Now, take a look at this number. In 2022, the actual rate of loans that went bad in these so-called risky developing countries was just 3.42%. Let that sink in for a second. That figure just flies in the face of the high-risk story we hear all the time.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. Check out this comparison. The actual difference in default risk between developed and developing nations is about 2.19 percentage points, okay? But the reward, the extra interest you get paid for that risk, is almost 9 percentage points higher. That means investors are getting paid more than 4 times for the actual risk they're taking. That is a massive, mispriced opportunity right there.
And if that wasn't enough, get this. Even in those rare cases where loans do go south, the recovery rates are incredibly high. We're talking an average of 72 cents back on every dollar. So the risk of something going wrong is lower than we think, and the loss, if it does happen, is way smaller than we fear.
So, if the data is showing that these markets are a lot more stable in their reputation, then why? Well, the answer is in what you could call the financial plumbing, all the hidden architecture that keeps the money flowing safely behind the scenes.
It's not magic. A stable, modern market that actually attracts investment is built on a very specific set of foundations. These are the things that create trust and predictability for everyone who's involved.
Think of these 4 pillars as the essential operating system for a modern economy. First, you need stable monetary policy, usually from a central bank, to keep the currency from going haywire. Second, you absolutely need a strong legal framework so people know contracts will be honored. Third, you need efficient payment systems to move money around quickly and securely. And finally, you need healthy competition to keep everything fair and innovative. When you have these 4 things, investors start to feel pretty confident.
And let's just zoom in on that legal framework for a second, because for an investor, this is everything. It answers all the big questions, right? Like, if I sign a contract, is it actually enforceable? If a business goes under, is there a clear, predictable process? These aren't just little details. They are the absolute bedrock of investor confidence.
And then you've got the tech side of things. Systems like RTGS, that stands for Real-Time Gross Settlement, they're total game changers. To put it simply, they let huge payments between banks happen instantly and permanently. This completely gets rid of the risk that a payment might fail hours or even days later, which makes the entire financial system way, way safer for everybody.
Now, look, this isn't to say there are no risks. Of course there are. But the whole point isn't to avoid risk completely. That's impossible. The key is to understand it, to price it correctly, and then to use the right tools to manage it.
And one of the most powerful tools out there is something called blended finance. This is where development funds, think public money, step in and take on the riskiest parts of a project. This creates a kind of cushion that makes the whole thing much safer and way more attractive for private investors to come in and fund the rest.
Another really smart tool solves a massive problem. How do you unlock local money?
Well, a Credit Enhancement Facility, or CEF, acts like an insurance policy. It makes a project's debt safer, and that gives a country's own big investors, like their pension funds, the confidence they need to invest in their own currency. It is a brilliant way to fund growth from the inside out, without having to rely so much on foreign money and all the currency risks that come with it.
So why is getting all this right so incredibly important? Well, because when you zoom out and look at the future of the global economy, pretty much all roads lead through these markets. Just look at this projection. By 2050, a staggering 70%, 70, of the world's real GDP growth is expected to come from today's emerging markets. This isn't just a side plot in the global economy. This is the main story for the next few decades.
And that brings us right back to the central idea, doesn't it? The goal isn't to find investments that have zero risk. That doesn't exist. The real goal is to be fully aware of what the real risks are and not be blinded by these exaggerated perceptions.
So the path forward seems pretty clear. Look past the perception and at the data, understand the tools that are out there to manage the real risk, and recognize the absolutely immense scale of the growth that's already happening.
So we'll leave you with this thought. If the biggest risk all along has just been perception, then that means the greatest opportunities are just waiting for those who are willing to see the reality. The only question left is, where will you look for them?